25th Amendment. Fixing Unfinished Business. Part 1. When the founders wrote the Constitution in 1787, they created the office of Vice President almost as an afterthought. They were trying to solve a problem with how presidents got elected, not thinking about what would happen if a president became too sick to do the job. This oversight would cause problems for nearly 180 years. It took a national tragedy and the threat of nuclear war to finally fix what the founders left unfinished. This is the story of the 25th Amendment. The Constitution says little about what happens if a president can't do the job anymore. Article 2 uses vague language. In case of the removal of the president from office, or of his death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the Vice President. Article 2 never says clearly whether the Vice President actually becomes president or just acts as president temporarily. And it says nothing about what happens if the Vice President's position becomes empty. It also doesn't explain who decides if a president is unable to serve or how that process works. For the first 50 years of American history, this didn't seem to matter much. Presidents served their terms and left office. That was about to change. In 1841, President William Henry Harrison died just 1 month after taking office. Vice President John Tyler did something bold. He declared that he was now the president, not just acting as president. Tyler took the oath of office and moved into the White House. Some people called him His Excellency and questioned his authority to do this. But Tyler insisted, and Congress went along with it. This set a precedent, but it still wasn't in the Constitution. The real problems came when presidents got sick but didn't die. In 1881, President James Garfield was shot. He lived for 80 days but couldn't do any work. Vice President Chester Arthur was afraid to take over because he thought people would say he was trying to steal power. So for nearly 3 months, America had no functioning president. Even worse was what happened with President Woodrow Wilson. In 1919, he had a massive stroke that left him partly paralyzed. His wife and his doctor hid how sick he was from Congress and the public. For the last year and a half of his presidency, his wife essentially made decisions for him. Vice President Thomas Marshall did nothing because there was no clear constitutional way for him to step in. President Dwight Eisenhower had a heart attack in 1955 and had other health problems during his time in office. Each time, people asked the same questions. Who's in charge? What if the president can't make decisions? What if he won't admit he's too sick to serve? By Eisenhower's time, something had changed that made these questions much more urgent. After World War II, America became a superpower with nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union also developed nuclear weapons and built missiles that could reach American cities in minutes. The president controlled America's nuclear arsenal. If the Soviet Union launched an attack, the president might have only minutes to decide how to respond. This meant the country couldn't afford to have confusion about who was in charge. There couldn't be a situation like with Garfield or Wilson, where no one knew if the president could do the job or who should take over. The stakes were too high. One moment of confusion could cost millions of lives. But it took a national tragedy to finally force action. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Vice President Lyndon Johnson immediately became president. This created a new problem. The vice presidency was now empty. Under the law at the time, the next person in line was Speaker of the House John McCormick, who was 72 years old. After him came the President pro tempore of the Senate, Carl Hayden, who was 86. President Johnson had a history of heart disease. If something happened to him, the presidency would go to elderly men who had never been elected to executive office. And there was no way to fill the empty vice presidency. This situation shocked Congress into action. Indiana Senator Birch Bayh had just become chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Constitutional Amendments and saw the chance to address problems that had existed since 1787. In the House, New York Representative Emanuel joined Bayh in pushing for a constitutional amendment. On January 6, 1965, just over a year after Kennedy's death, Bayh and Seller introduced their proposed amendment. It had 4 main parts. Section 1 made official what John Tyler had done in 1841. It says clearly that if the president dies, resigns, or is removed from office, the vice president becomes the president, not acting president. Section 2 solved the empty vice presidency problem. It says that when there's a vacancy in the vice presidency, the president nominates someone to fill it. Both the House and Senate must approve the choice by a majority vote. This way, the vice presidency doesn't remain vacant. Section 3 creates a way for a president to temporarily hand over power. If a president knows he'll be unable to do the job for a short time, like during surgery, he can notify Congress in writing. The vice president becomes acting president until the president sends another letter saying he's ready to take back the job. Section 4 is the most complicated. It provides a way to remove power from a president who can't do the job but won't admit it or step aside voluntarily. The vice president and a majority of the cabinet can declare the president unable to serve. If the president disagrees, Congress decides. It takes a 2/3 vote in both the House and Senate to keep the vice president as acting president. The amendment passed Congress on July 6, 1965, and went to the states for ratification. The 25th Amendment moved remarkably fast. The memory of Kennedy's assassination was still fresh. The Cold War was at its height. The need for clear rules about presidential succession was pressing. On February 10, 1967, Minnesota became the 37th state to ratify, and Nevada became the 38th, providing the needed 3/4 majority. Less than 2 years after Congress proposed it, the 25th Amendment became part of the Constitution. After 178 years, the founders' unfinished work was finally complete. Or so it seemed. The 25th Amendment didn't have to wait long to be used. 6 years after ratification, it proved its worth during the Watergate scandal. In October 1973, Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned after being charged with corruption. President Richard Nixon used Section 2 to nominate House Minority Leader Gerald Ford as vice president. Congress approved Ford. This was the first time Section 2 had been used. Less than a year later, Nixon himself resigned because of the Watergate scandal and impending impeachment proceedings. Ford became president under Section 1, making him the first president who had never been elected either as president or vice president. Ford then used Section 2 again to nominate Nelson Rockefeller as vice president. For the only time in American history, neither the president nor vice president had been elected to their offices, but the system worked smoothly. Section 3 has also worked well. In 1985, President Ronald Reagan had surgery for colon cancer. Reagan used Section 3 to temporarily transfer power to Vice President George H.W. Bush while he was under anesthesia. The transfer lasted just a few hours, but it showed the system could work for planned medical procedures. President George W. Bush used Section 3 twice, in 2002 and 2007, when he had colonoscopies. Vice President Dick Cheney became acting president for a few hours each time. Joe Biden used it once in 2021 during a routine medical procedure. These brief transfers of power happened without any problems or confusion. Sections 1, 2, and 3 have all worked exactly as intended. These sections solved problems the founders left unaddressed by creating clear rules for succession and temporary disability. But Section 4 of the 25th Amendment has never been used. The provision that allows the Vice President and Cabinet to remove an incapacitated president has never been invoked. Understanding why Section 4 doesn't work reveals a flaw in the amendment that its authors never anticipated. A flaw that has everything to do with politics and human nature. That's the subject of the next video in this series about the 25th Amendment. Make sure to subscribe to get notice of Part 2. Thanks for watching. Like and share to help combat constitutional illiteracy.